Just wanted to introduce ourselves and welcome to our Business Owner Series. Today, my name is Chris Law. I'm the partner for Incident Management and Offensive Security for M&P. I'll be the host and facilitator for this session, but I want to introduce Adriana Gliga. She's our National Privacy Leader for M&P, and she's based in Toronto, and myself, I'm based in Vancouver. So just some housekeeping. The final segment of this webinar will be for Q&A. So what you can do is if you can open up your Zoom Q&A button there, and then what we will be doing is monitoring the questions. So please ask your questions through the window throughout the presentation. And at the end, we'll start to answer the questions that are posted. Thank you very much. You can also if there's a similar question, obviously you can just upvote one and then of course use that so that we know which ones are more prioritized. We'll try to address as many questions as we can. If your question does not get answered, no worries. We'll make sure that we follow up with you. And at the same time, a link to this recording will be emailed to you afterwards. Just a quick disclaimer, the information provided within this webinar is just an overall generalization of specific cases. What we don't want to do is make any claim towards a specific incident or engagement. So just to go over today's agenda, there will be a discussion on the privacy trends. It's all about the data. And of course, where do we go from here? So without too much further ado, what we'll do is I'll now turn it over to Adriana Gliga, and then we can start this presentation. Thank you. Over to you, Adriana.
Thanks so much, Chris, and welcome everyone to our session today. So I thought I will start with a little bit about who is M&P. I know a lot of you are already working with us, but for those of you who are joining us first time, we are a proudly Canadian organization. We work very closely to the communities where we service our clients. And you see there are 125 offices across all provinces. And the fastest growing accounting, tax, but what it's even not as known, consulting services in Canada. So if we can go to the next slide. So the cybersecurity and privacy team, it's part of what we call M&P Digital, which is a full set of services that we provide to our clients in a consulting basis who are looking at digital transformation or technology transformation, applications, supply data and analytics, digital platforms, all the way to managed IT services. And as part of that, obviously, we have the cybersecurity and privacy practice. And if we look at our cybersecurity and privacy practice, we provide an end-to-end service catalog, starting with understanding or defining architectures, understanding the risk management and regulations that organizations need to comply with, privacy and data protection, which is quite an important topic these days, all the way to offensive security, incident management, as Chris mentioned before, and all the way to managed security services. And we service clients across the country, both public and private, and also not-for-profit. And if you can have a look at our clients, we really service most industries, and we have dedicated niches focusing on those industries. So now I'll dive right into the privacy trends. And I thought I will start with the question, what is personal identifiable information? And I'm sure a lot of you have seen this definition is from the Privacy Commissioner side. It's a factual or subjective information, which could be recorded or not, that identifies an individual. And I wanted to bring your attention to 3 different areas. So some of them might be very easy to determine, name, address, date of birth for a person. Then there will be more sensitive information, such as social insurance numbers, driver license, financial accounts, health information. And then might be some information that you don't usually think about it as private information, things like location information, IP address of a device that you own. So just to give you a little bit about what private information is, and what a trend that we see emerging, it's also inferred information that could identify a person. So what happens if you are on an airplane or you are taking a trip and you provide the details of what your meal wants to be, or what does that infer about the person on that in that airplane? So now that we looked at what personal information is, what we have seen from a global perspective, once the GDPR, or the European data protection legislation, was put in place in 2016, we have seen a multitude of initiatives across the world, and we have identified some of them here, but there are a lot more happening around updates to privacy legislation and the rights to individuals. And in North America will be something like the legislation in California that led the charge, and most recently in Canada. And Canada, it's a very complex environment. We have the Privacy Act, we have the PIPEDA, we have legislation at the federal level, we have legislation at provincial level. And then we have legislation related to personal information and legislation related to personal health information. And then on top of that, we have legislation that is mandated by regulated industries. So we have legislation around financial services. We have legislation around youth and children and families. We have legislation around other organizations that might be regulated in Canada. So in terms of proposed changes, we have seen quite a few changes happening in Canada. In Quebec, with Bill 64, it was proposed and approved into law in September of 2021, and went into enactment in September of 2022. In Ontario, we had Bill 188 related to the health legislation that was updated in March of 2020. There were a lot of consultations happening across the provinces, as you can see in Ontario, in BC, related to private sector legislation. And these were all happening because of the fact that our federal legislation needed to have some updating. And we've seen that happening as well at the federal level with the introduction of Bill C-11 in November of 2020, and then the update of that bill in 2022 with the introduction of Bill C-27. So quite a few changes happening in Canada. So if we are to look across this legislation changes, what are they trying to achieve? Really is looking at enhancing individuals' rights over their own data. It's also looking for the organizations to take accountability and provide more transparency around how data is collected and used, and improving oversight. So with GDPR, the big change that happened there, and I'm sure you have seen it in the news, with big tech companies being fined quite substantial amounts for infringing on privacy of individuals or not complying with the legislation. So that's one part, the privacy oversight and enforcement, that it's coming into Canadian legislation that has not been there before. So in terms of individual rights and data portability, and also consent, that we are using the information when we are collecting information, providing notices that are transparent and taking consent, and also being able to remove that consent if no longer somebody wants to have business with that organization. And I think what is very important, all this legislation that is coming is looking for organizations not just to have a privacy legislation, but what is more important, to be able to demonstrate that they have a privacy management program that can monitor how that privacy legislation is implemented. and not insignificant fines. So if you look there, penalties and private right of action, the fines are quite substantial, 20 million or 2% of worldwide turnover for failure to administer the regulations, or 25 million and 4% for criminal penalties. So if we move on to the next bill, so the federal bill, so we've seen the bill in Quebec. Now, if we look at the proposed federal bills, are pretty much aligned with that as well. So it's talking about consent by default. So you have to collect consent before you collect the information. It's talking about transparency, and especially if you are trying to use automated means for making decisions and ensuring that you advise your customers what you do. And then we see again the privacy management programs and the penalties coming into action as well. So what we've seen with Bill C-11 really was more focus put on oversight and enforcement of the legislation, which we have not seen in Canada before. Now, this bill has changed a little bit, and as on the next slide, we'll see Bill C-27. After consultation and feedback, more changes came into this new proposal. And what is very important to see is that there is the introduction of Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. A lot of customers I've talked to in the past, they were concerned about starting and using solutions that use AI and data analytics, because there was not a framework in place that could tell them what was okay to use in terms from a privacy perspective. So that's very encouraging that we see that, and we see that happening around the world as well. There are some updates to how the enforcement will be done to the Tribunal Act. And then there are some updates to the actual proposed legislation. And what we see from the lessons learned we had from implementation of the GDPR and then the CCPA in California was that managing consent is becoming very difficult for organizations, and not just for the organization implementing the solutions, but it's actually impacting us from a customer experience as we go and interact with these systems. So what we see changing in the Bill C-27, the definition of legitimate interest, and putting more focus on organizations of defining what the legitimate interest means, having a process to assess that. So in those cases where there is a legitimate interest in using the information, not to be collecting consent again. We also see a focus on minors and the rights and resources of minors. And what is also important to note, before Privacy Commissioner will only come and look at an organization if there was a complaint or a breach, and will do an assessment of their, or an investigation and assessment of their practices. Going forward, they could also come and just look at an organization without having a reason behind it. And what is important to, and a little different from the legislation in Quebec, is the definition of de-identification versus anonymization of data. And the de-identified data under the new legislation is still considered private information, under the assumptions that putting it together with other data sources that might exist out there, there is an opportunity to re-identify the person, versus anonymizing data will mean that that data cannot be used to re-identify a person in the future. So that's a important note to make, comparing the legislation from Quebec versus the federal legislation. And then if we look at what came out of some of the reports in different provinces, the BC report for modernizing the PIPA also focused on similar trends, and it's also recognizing that is important to be aligned with the European style requirements, but also to be aligned to the legislation across the country. So if we can move on to the next slide. So that's what's going on in the legislation world. Lots of changes. So, and we noted that at the beginning, it's all about the data. You have to look at what data you have and make decisions. And you know, as all this happened, we also had to deal with the impact of COVID. And what we have seen the pandemic impact being on organizations, organizations had to allow for increase of data collection and sharing of information to ensure that you know, the health and safety of employees. So this might have happened without changes to the privacy policies within the organization. We all moved to work from home. What does that mean from an enterprise perspective? Now, all employees become an extension of the enterprise and an endpoint, an entry point for an attack into the organization. We needed to reach our customers in different ways. So I talked to a lot of my clients, where they had to find different processes and different channels to be able to conduct business. So even that they might have face-to-face interaction before, now they had to use email or some other means of communication to engage with customers, or over phone, or over Teams or Zoom or anything else. So there are new models. We had to move into these new models pretty quickly, which means that in some cases there was no time to assess if those models are still okay from a security or privacy perspective. And the focus was really on operations and maintaining operations over time. So we talked about what's going on in the world. Changes are coming to privacy legislation everywhere. It's a very complex regulatory environment within Canada, and for organizations who operate in multiple jurisdictions. Organizations also have been collecting a lot more data, and they are also looking to see how they can get value from that data. Can that data be used for secondary purpose? Can they use new technologies? There is an increased number of breaches, and I'm sure Chris will tell you all about that. And with the new legislation on the privacy side, we'll see higher penalties and fines, and even right of action. So we'll see a lot more fines and financial impacts to organizations coming in. And a lot of organizations looked at privacy as being a barrier to innovation. But what we see happening with our clients, especially in technology sector, is that if privacy is built by design, and cybersecurity is built by security, and privacy are built by design into solutions, that can be a competitive advantage for organizations in working with their customers, and could be an enabler to innovation. And I work on a project where I had to review solutions that were put in models and AI algorithms, how data was used and what type of data should be used to make decisions or teach the models on how they are working. And having discussions with data engineers were quite interesting, because when I was there at the table, I will ask them, why do you need to use all these data elements? Is there a different way? What if you use this instead of this? And more times than not, I will have, oh, we never thought about it that way. Because most of the times we think we have all this data, why not just use everything? But there are innovative ways where we can achieve what we are planning to achieve and also maintain privacy. So as I mentioned, we cannot have privacy without security. And as you see there in that picture, is really an interconnection between data protection, having the right controls, understanding what data you have within the organization, putting the right controls around data, understanding how you want to use your data, and having the right processes in place to make decisions. And all this in connection together can contribute to privacy. Next slide, please. So where should the organization start? Understanding their data, understanding what they are trying to protect, understanding what are the legislation and regulatory requirements. How much data do I have? Where is it? Understanding how it flows. Am I integrated with third parties? Are third parties doing some processing for me? What is that flow of data from the time I'm asking the customer to provide the data all the way to the destruction of data? And then how do I define the policies and controls? How do I classify that data? And I define what type of controls I need to put around the data to make sure that is protected based on risk. Defining retention and disposal requirements, very important from a privacy perspective, because the privacy legislation, all of it says we should only retain for as long as we need it to provide this service. And most organizations have been retaining data forever, which makes that organization so much more attractive to an attacker and increases the risk in case of a compromise. And then once you define the policies, implementing those processes and ensuring that you monitor both internally, but also with your third parties on how the controls are implemented. So next year, we have some lessons learned from working with organizations across different sectors. So we said it's all about the data. So if there is no good data governance and ownership within the organization, it's difficult to manage data. It's difficult to manage privacy and security. And we see this all the time happening. You go and talk to a client and you ask, okay, who is the owner of the data? Everybody points to IT. Well, IT knows where the data is and what systems. So that unfortunately is not quite so for a lot of organizations, because we are collecting data to provide a service to our customers. So really the ones who decide what data needs to be collected and stored and for how long, it's usually the business process or the business side of the house. Then I mentioned this before, lack of understanding of data flows and inventories. A lot of organizations have duplication of data. They collect the data in one system, move it somewhere else, processes that require that you email it and then you print it and then you scan it. So a lot of different information assets in different formats across the organization, and not a good understanding of where those are. Obviously, there are lack of control. So if you don't know what data you haven't classified it, most likely you have not put the right controls in place. If you don't have a classification schema, you don't have controls defined by the sensitivity of the information, you are running into issues where either you might have to put controls in place across the organization because you don't know where they need to be, or you don't implement the controls in the highest risk areas. And okay, thank you, Chris. And this brings me to the last slide there. So how a privacy program, a mature privacy program should look like. So we said we are moving away from having a policy, but more of a managed privacy program where we manage the privacy risks and we monitor how that policy is implemented across the organization. So what are some of the things that we look for in a mature privacy program? Understanding what privacy means, understanding what are the third parties that you work with, the level of controls that you need to implement, and monitoring over time to make sure that if you make changes to business or processes, business processes or systems, those changes were made in such a way so not to introduce new vulnerabilities. Using the data only for the purpose, understanding if you want to use data for secondary purposes, what those purposes are and how do you make decisions. And one that I cannot stress enough, teaching your users, awareness training, and empowering your staff to protect data, to understand, identify, and protect data based on its sensitivity. And I guess with this, I'm completing the privacy section of this presentation. I'll pass it on back to Chris.
Great, thank you, Adriana. That was very insightful. What we would like to do, just briefly, just pivot over to informing the audience here on what the current cybersecurity trends and what the true costs behind a cyber incident. So with that, we wanted to relay some of the information, some of the cases and incidents that we've been dealing with at M&P. In the last 90 days, you've likely heard about all the major high-profile cyber incidents across the world. However, the truth is that many times a lot of these incidents are not reported locally within Canada. So we just want to bring to light the fact that there are large incidents, large ransomware payments that occur on any given week within Canadian organizations. It's not something that you hear about just in the US or overseas. Unfortunately, it happens right across Canada, across all the various verticals. So we still see a lot of electronic fund transfers, fraudulent ones, of course, without the proper controls within, let's say, accounts payable, accounts receivable. We still deal with a number of ransomware payments from anywhere from 2 million to 10 million US. And then, of course, because of the cyber insurance, we can talk for hours about cyber insurance, but as we know, we're seeing it, as Adriana mentioned, it's harder and harder to get cyber insurance. At the same time, the threat actors know that it's more difficult to receive payment. And so what they're doing is we see a trend where there's less sophisticated threat actors. Could be, your teenagers, others at home, just performing these types of small, unsophisticated attacks for less money, trying to extort anywhere from 10,000, 5,000, 10,000 up to 50,000. So not in the millions, but we're seeing a majority of growth in that area. And unfortunately, we are seeing a lot more denial of service attacks against supply chain and natural resources. Okay. So what things do we think about for not doing anything? So we think everything is backed up. That may be true. You may have a good backup system. However, unfortunately, for the ease and convenience of folks, we tend to say, okay, well, let's have online backups. We can quickly restore them. But the issue is that the majority of time, that's what the threat actors do in terms of the first target. Whether it's privacy data or any other data, they quickly go to the backups and try to encrypt them and delete them. We maybe put too much trust in the large providers, Amazon, Microsoft, Google. Yes, they do have a lot of controls in place to help protect to a level of your data. However, these, shall we say, default settings, they must be customized to suit your organization. You can't just assume that they will protect your data. We need to be sure that we run our own assessments against that cloud so that we understand that, okay, it's our little sandbox, but we still need to put walls around it rather than just trust the big tech companies to do that. We have cyber insurance. And again, we don't want to talk for hours about this, but again, it's onerous because the multi-millions of dollars of ransomware payments that have gone out in the last few years. The insurance carriers are most now, shall we say, unwilling to sort of pay the coverage, even though it seems legitimate. We paid our premiums and everything. I spend most of my time, unfortunately, not on the technical aspect, but dealing with counsel, and of course, these insurance carriers to, on behalf of our clients, to try to say that, hey, we've done everything right. We are entitled to this ransomware payment. You must help cover it. And we find it more and more times that they're pushing the finer print and trying to obviously perhaps even just pay half or even a quarter of the amount that we're actually covered for. And then, of course, we don't have anything valuable to steal. And there's always something that is valuable. As Adriana mentioned, the various types of PII, even if you have a manufacturing company or something that just creates a standard widget, we have to understand that our employee data can obviously be valuable. It will have a lot of ramifications when, identity theft and things like that. And of course, class action litigation is now rampant across Canada, where there are class action lawyers that simply line up. Once they hear anything of your organization that may be breached, they will quickly advertise, hey, are you involved with XYZ organization? If so, they've been breached, whether it's true or not, and then please sign up here to be part of this class action lawsuit. So we're seeing right across each of the provinces this growing trend in the last year or two. So really quickly, just wanted to say what's the tactical aspects of what saves or destroys a business. So as Adriana mentioned, fundamental table stakes. You must train your staff. Make sure that they understand what a phishing email looks like. What's the best thing to do? How to look at a bad link? Don't click here. Make sure you have strong passwords. All that fundamental things that we have to know. Again, I mentioned backups. Make sure that they're not only online but offline. I may be aging myself here, but tape backups were the greatest things since sliced bread, I think, because they were offline. You store them in a secure location. And of course, number 3, multi-factor authentication. I know a lot of you think, well, it's annoying. You have to do this, you have to use your phone, you have to, all this other additional steps. But these top 3 things, awareness training, backups, and MFA, these are the critical aspects that even the insurance carriers look for. If you don't have this in place, if regulators don't see you sort of practicing this or implementing these things, then the fault is really yours. And then the others, of course, are just as important, but lesser so. Logs and monitoring, practicing what to do in an incident. I mean, I'm sure we all practice earthquake and or fire drills. We should practice a cyber incident preparedness drill. And then, of course, keeping things offline. I mean, so many times, even the more sophisticated and more mature organizations, they have everything online, it's very convenient, but when everything goes down and everything's encrypted, do they have a printout of anything? So usually they don't, even the largest. So it makes sense, keep it simple. It's okay to print something out, a list of contact information, a list of passwords, keep it in a safe, just in case, things, everything's encrypted, okay? So, as you know, we do have 20 questions, which is great. Thank you, everyone, for entering those questions in the Q&A. So what we'll do now is sort of go through those questions, and maybe I'll read out some of the more popular ones, and Adriana, maybe you can help respond. Let's see, from Jane Erickson, we'll see, as a relatively new business, what steps can we take not only to protect our privacy, but a shift with the new legislations? Over to you, Adriana.
Yeah, so for new businesses and even startups that I talk to, obviously at first you need to focus on building the business. But what we see is that even for new businesses, when they are looking to get investments or new round of investments or money to grow the business, we see a lot more organizations or banks or investors looking for information on what do you do from a cybersecurity and privacy perspective. So I think, even that is difficult at first to start in a new business. What is important is to understand what kind of information you are collecting through that new business. If you do collect a lot of personal information, what's the risk that you are running, and then how can you put some controls in place to to show the investors that, and your customers, because you probably want to grow the business, that you are taking this seriously. And you can start small, build your policy, train your employees. I worked with some new businesses that were building solutions. So what they ended up doing was train all the developers on what privacy means and how to securely build applications, because that will take away a lot of pain later when you have a product or you have a business process defined and you have to retrofit it to meet the privacy legislation.
Thank you, Adriana. A popular question from Trina: what would there be a possible template of what a policy should look like for handling data and controls that are in place? Something simple for smaller organizations.
Yeah, so what we have in Canada, our privacy legislation is based on what is called the 10 information privacy principles. So those 10 information privacy principles are a very good starting point for organizations into building their policy, because it talks about accountability, who is accountable within the organization, consent, why you are collecting the information, and how you are going to use it, what you are doing to protect that information for your customers, and then how they can reach out to you in case they have a complaint or they want to change the information that they have about you. So having somebody assign or an email address where they can send that communication, it's very important. So start there with the 10 information principles, and that always gives you a pretty good comprehensive way of covering privacy in a policy.
Okay. Thank you. From Sylvia: these regulations are onerous for small businesses. How does a small business navigate compliance?
Very good question. And I get this question all the time. It's like, well, I'm a very small business. I only have a few people. What does that mean to me? So who applies to privacy regulations? To everybody who collects personal information. So it's really, everybody should start with a risk assessment. How much information I collect, where it is, what happens if this information goes out? What does it mean to my business? Am I going to be out of business? Am I going to provide the personal information out there? Customers will not work with me. What does it mean to me? And then define what the program looks like. And it doesn't need to be very onerous. You just need to document the controls that you have around your business processes. The smaller the business processes, probably the less onerous the program. But what is important is to recognize, okay, I'm a small business. I actually use a lot of third parties. So probably third-party risk is very up there. So how do I build those processes first to ensure that I understand what third-party risk is, and how do I monitor that those third parties who are helping me in building the business or providing customers with the services. So it's always about understanding where your higher risks are and focusing your effort and building things around that.
Okay. Thank you, Adriana. So really just a follow-up, and this is very popular, is it so every single organization must comply, even the very smallest of businesses?
Well, I guess the question is, ask yourself if something goes wrong and you are in the news. I know some organizations do not have to comply with legislation, so a lot of the not-for-profits do not have to comply with the legislation. But I always ask if you have high net worth donors and their information goes out, what does that mean to you? So it's good practice to protect the information that is the most sensitive in the organization.
Okay. So really, I guess I'll help with this one from Neo. So companies are not all created equally. Is there some form of preventative measures based on the size and resources of each? I'll answer that initially from for the cybersecurity incident sort of handling aspect. And I get asked this question a lot. I mean, we do not have all the resources in the world, Chris. What do we do, right? So really, small, big, medium-sized business, as I stressed before, number one, make sure that at least your one-person staff or your second two people are all trained or at least have some cyber awareness training. And then number two, again, going back to the backups, make sure you have, backups and something that you, it's a boring task, but that saves any size of business, even the smallest ones. And then number three, other than strong passwords, yeah, just make sure that you have MFA. So you'll hear that time and time again. So that's from the cybersecurity perspective. I don't know, Adriana, do you have any from the privacy perspective?
Yeah, so from the privacy perspective, back to employee awareness. So ensure that your employees know what they are collecting and how sensitive that data is, and they have guidance on how to protect that customer data. That's where it all starts. And then the second part to that will be, don't keep it. If you don't have it, you don't have to protect it. If you only need it for a certain purpose, when it's no longer needed, get rid of it. You asked for about proactive. So that's the best proactive measure. Don't keep it if you don't need it. Then you don't have to spend money to protect it.
Okay, great. And from Jane again, so you say train employees on this info. Are there training courses? Where do we get that kind of training?
Yeah, so there are definitely, so what I see, there are organizations who choose to engage a third party. There are lots of different options these days on training and packages that you could buy through vendors to train your employees. But I think the best training you can do to your employees are things that they can relate to. So rather than gamification, things that they can relate to from their own personal experience. Because it's otherwise they can just click through a training, and at the end of it, they might not remember much of it. So my experience, always make it personal to the staff, incorporate lessons learned from current incidents that happen, or how can they relate directly to it in terms of what personal information means or what data security means to them.
Okay, great. And I think that covers a little bit of what Chris asked about how are the best ways. Thank you for that, Adriana. And I think, let's see, I'll help answer this one. Can you help, or can you send us a template for decision tree for ransomware? Exactly. There is quite often, as a small business or medium business, we want to think about when do we pay ransom, if we even should pay ransom, and all the things that, all the risk factors that will be built into that final decision. So yes, we can go through that. There would be, it's not just the CEO that has to follow this ransomware event, but it's also, you have to think about if you do have, let's say, a board or a board of advisors, and or the, shall we say, third-party stakeholders in your business organization. Each of those parties would obviously want to be, may have a decision point in that. So again, using this decision tree, hopefully during a time where we can practice this, is the best way to determine what's lacking or what things will trigger whether we go ahead with a ransomware payment or not. Okay. All right, so let's see other questions. What is a good privacy framework that we can recommend for a startup to adopt? I don't know, Adriana, do you have any insight on that?
The same with the 10 information privacy principles. And we have like the GAP framework for assessing privacy program maturity, which is, I believe, posted by ISACA, that can be used, and just start small. Start with a couple of controls in every area, and then as you mature the program, you add controls.
One question from Neo: how does this proposed legislation compare to GDPR, and how is it different?
Okay, very, very good question. So I think I mentioned, but if I didn't, I will reiterate now. So the reason we see all these changes happening around the world in legislation is because we had something that was called adequacy between the privacy legislation between European Union and North America, both Canada and the US, and we had something called Privacy Shield. That was in the legislation. So what does that mean is that we can exchange information between different jurisdictions because there is an understanding that the information is secured the same way. So what we see with the changes to our legislation is going towards being aligned with the GDPR. So we can keep that adequacy between our countries. A lot of Canadian organizations do have operations across multiple jurisdictions, so that is becoming very important now. So some differences, obviously, the GDPR is ahead of us, and they have very specific requirements that they define. They also had quite a few years to look at how things work. So what we see in the Canadian legislation, we are trying to adjust our legislation for some of the challenges that GDPR has seen. And I mentioned consent and by consent by default and the challenges that it created for organizations and also for consumers in implementing that. So we are trying still to keep alignment with their legislation, but trying to adopt it a little bit in such a way that it doesn't become so onerous for organizations and for consumers. So we see some changes, also anonymization, de-identification, definition. So there are some things that are not quite aligned around the world. We have seen in GDPR the definition of data processor and data controller, and the contractual clauses that need to be established in between, which we don't have such defined ones yet in the Canadian legislation. But I think monitoring of third parties is still becoming something that we need to define and manage within those privacy management programs. And accountability. So what is quite not quite at the same level, but what we see focus on in Canada is assigning accountability for privacy to a person within the organization. And we all understand if it's a small organization, might not be a designated person that's their only job. We have seen clients where it's set to within the risk or with the CFO or with the CEO as part of their job, not necessarily just a person that was designated just to privacy.
Thank you, Adriana. So a popular question is what sort of structures I assume organizations would require cyber insurance? I'll try that one. So cyber insurance for a business, a lot for the last, I guess, 4 years, a quick history is that it was an easy thing to buy back 4 or 5 years ago because it was a simple addendum. They made the policy sound very attractive. They would cover every cost, including reputation and everything else. How do you measure that? Another question. So unfortunately, because of the number of attacks now and the number or the billions that were paid out by the insurers, the trend now is a lot of the companies, mid-sized companies, small companies, are foregoing the cyber insurance premiums because it's becoming too onerous to meet their requirements. And so it might not be a fit for everybody. What we're seeing is a lot of folks that had insurance are choosing not to renew and rather pool, insure, I guess we do insure pooling with other like organizations, or investing that money into just doing the best practices to protect themselves or self-insure. So really, I guess, to answer the question itself, in terms of what organizations, you would have to do a risk assessment based on the potential for litigation, perhaps, and the potential third-party litigation against your organization if there was an incident. And so quite often you have to do that kind of assessment and determine, okay, is it worth it? So for those of you who already have cyber insurance, great. Make sure you obviously fulfill your notification and make sure you pay attention to your controls and requirements, because what I've seen is, unfortunately, when there is an incident, it's always a question of when, you'll notice that they quickly try to say you didn't do this, or you didn't have this, or you didn't have, your system accounts multi-factor authenticated and things like that. They will go immediately to the fine print and put up barriers before they, ante up the payment. Okay, so another question we have here is simply from Kingsley. What is percentage of attacks that originate from endpoints like laptops, desktops versus cloud servers, databases? I would say for a typical organization, it starts with either an exposed server, which may be unpatched, or 90% of the time it is from a laptop, desktop, unfortunately through a phishing email or something that a user may have installed, clicked on, things like that. Eventually, once they gain access, then they, of course, go to the servers and the cloud. We do not see too much attacks directly on a database, meaning that they don't copy the whole database from that. What they're really after is a quick smash and grab, gather as many sensitive files that exist on file directories, and then do their thing, meaning ransomware, encrypt, and so on. So hopefully that answers that. Okay. Just
There were
checking
quite a few
here.
questions around health information, and I just wanted to answer that. So what do we do for health information? How to protect our customers? So unfortunately, for health information, we have different legislation in different provinces. So it's important to understand what legislation applies to you. Those legislations could be different in terms of what they require for organizations to do. But most of them require to do a privacy impact assessment of the solutions that you might be using. Even if it's like a third party, you should be asking them, have they had a privacy impact assessment done? And what does that mean? And then you need to understand if in your province, you need to provide that privacy impact assessment to the privacy commissioner. Most privacy commissioner offices actually provide a template on how those privacy impact assessments need to be conducted and what information needs to be collected through them. Even for other kind of information, the Canada Privacy Commissioner Office provides quite a bit of information on how to do different things, where to start. If you go on LinkedIn and connect with the privacy commissioner, I noticed they have every week guidance on something else, and they are focusing on small businesses as well. So it's important to use those tools to start your program. You don't have to start from scratch on anything.
Okay, just be mindful of time here. Just some, what we'll do is we'll obviously record some of the questions that we cannot answer in our time slot here. We wanted to, first of all, say that there is going to be a poll in case that there would be any of the audience members would like us to follow up from an M&P person to follow up and reach out to them. We will do that. At the same time, we would also like to thank Adriana for her insight on the privacy policies, and also we want to thank you for your time and for your attention to this very critical and important topic. And of course, being Cyber Awareness Month or Cyber Incident Awareness Month for this month, for October, we just want to say thank you and make sure that you stay safe. And we'll be obviously sending a copy of this recording to all the attendees. Okay.
And if you need to any question answer or would like to talk to us about how to start your program, you have our email addresses in there in the presentation. Please reach out to us.
Okay, thank you everyone, and stay safe. And thank you for attending this Business Owner Series. See you next time.
Thank you.